Hello and welcome to DNet, the Disability Network. I'm Susan Pettit-Crossman. On today's show, we'll take a look at how people with disabilities made their voices heard in the recent federal election campaign. We'll hear how people in the disability rights movement rate the job that was done by the former government. And we'll hear their expectations for the new government. First, here's this week's Disability News highlights. Representatives of people with haemophilia in Canada say they are shocked that the Red Cross is still not able to ensure safe blood products. They're reacting to an admission by the Red Cross that some blood products from Germany were not tested for HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. The Red Cross has to recall the 3 million units of this blood clotting agent. Meanwhile, the inquiry into Canada's blood supply began last week. Deborah Brown in Ottawa has been covering the story and brings us this report.
There are about 1,000 people across Canada who were infected with HIV after they received contaminated blood or blood products. Many were hemophiliacs.
Mothers of HIV-affected children say, "I just want to know what happened. Then I can have some peace." HIV-positive hemophiliacs say, "I'm probably going to die, but let not my death be in vain."
As the judicial inquiry opened, Justice Horace Creever said tough questions will be asked, but he is only after the facts.
It is not, and it will not be a witch hunt. It is not concerned with criminal or civil liability. I shall make findings of fact. It will be for others, not for the Commission, to decide what actions, if any, are warranted by those findings.
The role the Canadian Red Cross Society played will be one that will come under close scrutiny during this inquiry.
There are people out there who have suffered a great tragedy. They have every right to have their questions answered. We have every right to defend our actions as well, and we will do so.
The inquiry is spending this week determining who will get standing. That includes funding and the right to cross-examine witnesses. Cross-country public hearings won't begin until sometime in the new year. Justice Creever is supposed to submit his final report by the end of September, but he's already served notice he'll likely need more time for a full examination of Canada's blood system. Deborah Brown, CBC News, Ottawa.
The current blood scandal has given rise to an argument in favor of a blood processing plant in Halifax. Evelyn Gigantes, Ontario's housing minister, has introduced legislative changes to the Landlord and Tenant Act. She claims that the changes will improve the rights and security of people living in care homes.
The purpose of the bill is to extend tenant protection to residents in unregulated care homes and apartments in houses.
The minister says 47,000 people living in care homes, many of whom are disabled or elderly, will be given full rights as tenants. In addition, people living in the estimated 100,000 illegal apartments across Ontario will also be protected under the Act. Dr. Ernie Lightman, who wrote a report recommending the changes, says the legislation will protect vulnerable tenants from abuse.
They are to have the same rights and responsibilities as everyone else. They are no longer to be considered as commodities to fill beds and to generate per diems for landlords.
Until now, tenants living in nursing homes or group homes were subject to arbitrary eviction. In Montreal, a local breeder says he has a new type of guide dog. The dog is a special breed that has been trained to assist people who have both a sight and physical disability. Scott Laurie has the details.
Eric Curtis test runs a new breed of guide dog. He lost his sight 3 years ago, and he's also paralyzed from the waist down. But his new dog, Maya, helps him get around. The dog is a cross between a Labrador and a Swiss Bernese mountain dog. Its breeder says the Labrador part gives the dog its toughness, the Bernese part its gentleness.
She'll help him as far as, picking up things and a lot more independent. He won't need somebody to pull him up there or push him up a ramp. He'll be able to do it himself.
Yeah.
If he drops something, he doesn't have to ask anybody else. He'll be able to do it all by himself.
The Mira Foundation showcased the dogs for the beginning of its annual fundraising campaign. It costs about $12,000 to train the dogs, but the people who need them get them for free. The foundation uses donations to train 60 dogs every year, but demand is so high, organizers say they need about 125 dogs a year.
We have to select the type of dog who's going to give us or give them the best.
It took Eric St. Pierre 4 years to breed the dogs. They're so new he hasn't found a name for them yet. And even people in Europe and Asia are asking him how to breed them. But right now, he's happy just helping someone like Eric.
I guess he'll have a lot more friends too. Make him really popular, more than he already is.
Scott Laurie, CBC News, Montreal.
And that's this week's roundup of disability news. When we return, we'll take a look at the role played by people with disabilities in the recent election campaign. It's been a month since the federal elections. This year, more polling stations were made accessible, so more Canadians with disabilities than ever before could vote. There are 4 million people with disabilities in Canada. That number of people can have quite an effect on the outcome of an election. During the summer, before the election date of October 25th was announced, we spoke to 2 people from the riding of Vancouver Centre who were preparing for the election. The riding, which is now represented by Liberal Hetty Fry, was at the time represented by Kim Campbell. Margot Massey and Robin Loxton are members of BCCPD, the British Columbia Coalition of People with Disabilities.
Disabled people, like anyone else, have been disenchanted with politics and politicians, and that. But I think the alternative to that is worse. That we have to encourage people to be involved and to speak up, because what happens is that the politicians won't make the changes unless we as advocates constantly remind them and constantly pressure them to make the changes that we ask for. That's the only way that we're ever going to make any changes.
We see it as our job as the provincial advocacy organization to get people out asking the questions that are important to them in their constituency. And we'll certainly provide guidance as far as through perhaps our newsletter, our magazine, to let people know what we see as the major issues.
And sometimes when you have a party position put in writing, then it's easier to follow up on.
I have spoken privately with all the candidates and asked them.
And once the federal election campaign was in full swing, people with disabilities began to get active across the country. COPO, the Coalition of Provincial Organizations of the Handicapped, did send out questions to all the parties, and they all responded. The letters that came back ranged from detailed responses to an outright refusal by the Reform Party to even answer the questions, a refusal which is on record. Late in September, a coalition of 500 Alberta community groups launched the Listen Up campaign. The coalition's campaign was aimed at increasing awareness of the issues among political candidates and encouraging people with disabilities to get involved. The effects of the campaign are currently being evaluated. I spoke with Diana Brent, one of the coordinators of the Listen Up campaign. What issues did you feel you wanted addressed in this campaign?
We thought it was very important to keep the issues to ones that were important to everybody, not just people with disabilities. So we focused on the economy primarily, and within that area we looked at effective employment programs for people with disabilities, adequate income supports for those people who were unable to work, and then we focused on accessibility in the workplace so that people could get to the jobs that they had.
What audience were you trying to reach, Diana?
I would say we had 3 audiences at different levels. The first one was the candidates themselves. We sent a questionnaire out to 103 candidates, and we got responses from 58 of those 103. And 18 Liberals responded and 10 NDP responded, and PCs 14 responded, and the Reform 16. And I know that doesn't equal to 103, but the other people within that group, which were then 45, didn't respond at all. So the candidates were the one group. The next group were the people with disabilities, because traditionally it has been difficult to get them out to voice their opinions, tell their candidates what they thought. And what I found was particularly interesting, this was the first time I personally had gone out and talked to candidates. And at first it's very scary, because you see them as somehow up on a pedestal and they know a lot more than you do about most things. And yet when you start to talk about disability issues as an individual, you know more than they do in most cases. And so you have information to give them. So I found that really built confidence in going ahead and pursuing that process through. The third group, and we had a Listen Up poster with our logo on it, and that we put out in shopping malls, in libraries, everywhere we could get them put up. And that was to get the general public aware, because with our mail-in cards, we wanted not only for people with disabilities to send those in, but we wanted their families, their friends, people who discovered our information to also get interested in the issues, because we have to be integrated and get everybody on side, not just the people with disabilities.
But what did you learn that you could pass on to our viewers, for example, for future knowledge, how to do this right?
I think the information, we got responses back from our community groups, and we've only sent out the evaluation, let's say, a week and a half ago, and we sent out 300 responses, and we have just about the 10% back now, but we're expecting more. And the information was really valuable. So I guess what I would pass on to other groups is, yes, it's important, consolidate. What we found was people with disabilities, particularly community groups, were able to consolidate around these issues. And if you pick something that's common to everybody, then you're able to get people on side. And although the bottom line was it was still difficult to get individual people with disabilities to, say, come out and be really active in the process, this is a step. And if you're going to walk 1,000 miles, you have to take a step first. And that's definitely what we did.
Do you feel you were successful?
I think we were successful, yes. And what's really nice is because of these candidate questions that we asked, and we asked things like, what were the top 3 issues for people with disabilities? Did they feel? We can go back to them now because we have their issues, to the elected politicians, and say, look, this is what you said on your form. Now, how are you going to carry this out? So I see the election as being the beginning of a process that has to continue for the next 4 years until the next election.
Do you feel that the political candidates are fairly in tune or aware of disability issues, or do they have a lot to learn yet?
I think more of them are more aware than they used to be, but there's still a long way to go, and we've just started a process that has to continue.
So we have to get a little noisier and be a little more proactive.
You got that right.
Thanks a lot, Diana.
Thank you.
All candidates' meetings to address disability issues were held in many parts of the country. This Listen Up poster advertised a meeting in Toronto. When we come back, we'll take a look at the record of the last government with respect to disability issues. As we mentioned earlier, COPO wrote to the leaders of the federal parties during the election campaign. The organization also published this brochure titled "We're Losing Ground, Disability Rights Threatened." It states the Government of Canada must be judged upon its public policy record. Here's their assessment of a number of concerns that have arisen between September 1984 and June of this year. Medicare. We're losing ground. Transfer payments reduced. Social assistance. We're losing ground. Social welfare payments to provinces cut. Training. People with disabilities made ineligible because training programs are linked to UI. Human rights. Promises broken. Canadian laws still violate the Charter. Employment equity. No positive results. Employment equity must be amended to include goals and timetables. Transportation. Slow but steady progress. Interprovincial busing is totally inaccessible. Income tax. Progress for those who are employed. Communications. Too little, too late. Alternate media and closed captioning are extremely limited. Joining me now from Winnipeg is Paula Kierstead, who's with the organization that was formerly called COPO. And Diane Richler from the Canadian Association for Community Living has joined me in the studio. Paula, to start, what's COPO's new name?
The answer is Council of Canadians with Disabilities, and we're proud to carry that new name. Thanks for asking.
No problem. I'd like to start with the issues, Diane, for people with disabilities and look at the last decade of our government. We seem to be making some headway. What happened?
Well, I think it's important to remember that the charter provisions that protected people on the basis of mental and physical disability only came into effect in 1985. And I think that we had a period of euphoria when a number of relatively easy changes could be made to legislation and programs could be put in place where nothing had existed before. So there was a lot of excitement around the creation of a secretariat for persons with a disability, infusion of new monies into programs for people with a disability, and changes in some major pieces of legislation. But after the first euphoria settled down, I think that we started to get to some of the tougher issues, the issues that have more systemic implications for people and that touch at the difficulties of poverty and unemployment of people with a disability. Those aren't quite as easy to solve with a little bit of window dressing. We were in a period of increasing economic hardship and financial restraint, and as the issues became tougher and the financial climate became also more difficult, I think that our victories became less and less significant.
Paula, do you agree with Diane?
Yes, Diane, I think you've stated it well, and one of the major issues to the council now will be that this whole unemployment fiasco that's happening in our country is particularly hard-hitting when it comes to the community of disabled citizens. I think there's a couple of reasons for that, and one is the fact that really the employment equity program that exists in our country has very little teeth to it. Employers have been invited to report, and it's considered mandatory, but there's very little that happens if they don't. And it's questionable if anyone's really benefited from the equity program. The first 5-year review showed that disabled citizens had no higher rate of employment between 1986 and 1991. So I think even though, as Diane says, there's been some initial and some significant legislative changes, how they're proving in the pudding is another thing.
Diane, why did these priorities change towards people with disabilities with the government?
Well, I think that we had a few particular and important programs in place. There was the national strategy on the integration of persons with a disability that was brought into place. That was a substantial amount of money, but I think to some extent that displaced some of the more systemic issues that needed to be dealt with. I think the other fact is that some of the issues that affected us negatively were not identified primarily as disability issues, the most important of which probably was the cancellation of the Charter Challenges program that really pulled the rug out from under the community of people with a disability.
Paula, have you got anything to add to Diane's comments?
Well, I think she stated very clearly that there certainly have been some initiatives, but they have detracted from addressing systemic issues. The national strategy you referred to, Diane, also wasn't even coordinated, so in fact we don't even know where that money went in the end or how it went. With regards to the court's challenge, of course it was brought back in, but certainly just before an election call, and all those things make us very uncomfortable and unsure of what the future is.
We'll be right back with more issues of disability and the government. federal Liberal Party swept to power on a rising tide of support that peaked on election night. Here are some impressions of that evening.
Canada has a Liberal majority government. Jean Chrétien will be the nation's 20th Prime Minister.
Tonight, as a very proud Liberal, I'm happy to accept the challenge of forming a government. I will think of the famous Liberal tradition of building a Canada that will always have in mind social justice and economic prosperity. But our mandate is very clear. We have to concentrate all our efforts on the economy to create jobs, to have economic growth, to give dignity to the workers who wants to work across this land.
We're back with Diane Rischler of the Canadian Association for Community Living and Paula Kierstead from the Council of Canadians with Disabilities. Paula, is there reason to hope for optimism with the new Chrétien government in terms of the social justice, hope, and economic security campaign that he's announcing?
Yes, I think so. And why I say that particularly is Jean Chrétien himself has made some comments recognizing some of the inequalities disabled people experience. And by appointing Lloyd Axworthy to be in charge of the Human Resources Department, that's significant to us as Manitobans and as Canadians, because I think what it points out is Mr. Axworthy has made comments of recognizing disincentives that exist with regards to the social assistance programs, as well as the fact that training dollars aren't there to encourage disabled people to get out and work.
So Diane, what kind of results would you expect from this new Liberal government then?
I think one of the first changes that we're seeing is a much more open process of government, a willingness to consult with people representing the community of people who have a disability as part of Canadian communities rather than a distinct and separate group. And I'm very hopeful that that will lead to programs and legislation that's much more inclusive of people with a disability.
But if we look at the continuing downsizing of our governments, do you think that this in fact may wipe people with disabilities and their issues right off the table?
I hope not. I think that it's significant that during the campaign, albeit through an unfortunate situation, Mr. Chrétien expressed his personal experience with having lived with some of the labels of disability as a child. And I think that his sensitivities are quite profound. Again, I think the secret is not in having separate programs for people with a disability, but in being included in the overall processes of government, and that will be the test.
Paula, one final question. What do you think the priorities for people with disabilities should be in addressing our government?
Right now, I think it's training and jobs. There's no doubt about it. And along with that, of course, is income security and some of the disincentives that exist right now in that program. So we've got a lot of hard work, and I think Diane's point about the fact that what we're experiencing and have been experiencing for years, other Canadians are also starting to get to that level of experience of unemployment. And there's a lot of commonality we need to build with our allies now.
Paula, thank you for joining us on the Disability Network.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And Diane, thank you also.
It's always a pleasure to be here.
That's our look at the election campaign and the new government. If you have any thoughts, write to us. Our address is coming right up. That's our show. I'm Susan Pettit-Crossman. See you again next week. Now, here's our address. Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W1E6. That's the Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W1E6.